I'm really excited that you guys took time out of your life for today. Thank you all just for that. So I fell in love with fresh flower at first bite. That was 10 years ago, and ever since I've been trying to figure out how to make it more popular. Luckily, there's an incredible group of fun, smart people engaged in this work, many of them right here. So as we start our day of thinking about next steps in grains, I'm going to show you where we've been as a grain shed, where we are right now, and where we are going. That says fresh flower is a secret I don't want to keep, and I hope that by the end of the day we can figure out how to break that code of silence. So we're going to look backwards first. Corn is the only grain that's native to the Americas. Grains are the seeds of certain grass plants, and we bring our staple crops wherever we go. When the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts, they brought wheat and rye. The wheat did poorly in coastal New England, but the rye survived, and cornmeal rye became a staple. Bakers will recognize these two ingredients as part of brown bread. In colonial times, malting was a domestic chore done by women. We were growing our bread and our beer as soon as white people began colonizing the Americas. So this stuff we're doing in grains is a tradition. It's not brand new. The Dutch loved New York for a lot of reasons, particularly all things wheat. The Van Cortlandt Manor in Westchester County had 24 mills spread across its vast holdings. Further upstate, the Schoharie Valley became the breadbasket for the Revolution. Vermont was the oat basket for our machines, horses. During the Civil War, Maine and New York were the breadbaskets for the Union Army, and some historians argue that that's why the Union won. Into the early 1900s, breweries had their own malt houses. Milling was once so common that the post office had places change their name so that there weren't so many Millertons, Miller's Crossing, Miller everything. Think about how many people with the last name Miller you know. They're not all flour people, but you see the point. So how did we get here where local grains are not the rule? I blame it on the Erie Canal, which I really love, but let's blame them. This key piece of infrastructure created a wheat boom in western New York, making Rochester the flour city and yanking Yankee farmers away from their craggy, stony soils over to the very fresh, fertile ground of the Genesee Valley to mine wheat. The Erie Canal dropped the price of shipping wheat from western New York from $100 a ton to $10 a ton. But the canal was not a one-way street. The Erie Canal also opened up access to even better, flatter farmland, pushing wheat production out first to Ohio, then Illinois, and then beyond. Wheat boomed and busted as America stretched west. All of this didn't happen overnight. Here's how the milling centers moved around America. 1650 was New York City, 1900 we had Buffalo, and then Buffalo fell downhill from there. This says Know Your Flour, and it's an Indiana ad from 1915. The American Miller was the trade organization magazine, and I love to look at it and see where we were. 1915 is a pretty good year to look back at because we still had a lot of stuff happening, and it hadn't all gone away. But even then, Indiana was encouraging its growers to name their own flour. These are the wheat acres that were harvested starting in New York State, starting in 1866. That's 570,000 bushels, and we still only have 90,000. But we kept going till 1900. 1900, we still had 500,000 bushels of wheat. So if you think wheat doesn't belong here, that's not true. If you've ever been to Buffalo, have you smelled the Cheerios getting baked? Right? So the perfume is an anomaly, but the process of tucking grain production and processing out of sight included land grabs, train routes, and advances in farm equipment that stole our habits of grain cultivation and processing. Milling and malting centers developed elsewhere, and prohibition sealed the deal, closing down our regional capacity to make brewing grains. With these critical pieces of infrastructure hidden from most Americans, the realities of grain growing and milling and malting vanished. The most we know of our staple crops is a metaphor. Our daily bread, amber waves of grain, the occasional harvester in an ad at the Super Bowl. But we can't let go of these words and images. And that's because they have a deep root in our psyche and our culture. So where are we now? There are more than verbal references to wheat happening, as evidenced by our sold-out event today. My impatience makes me feel like we are still at the starting line of rebuilding our Grainshed. But as you can see, from virtually nothing, a ton of interest in infrastructure has emerged over the last 15 years. We now have mills, this is the slide from your program, and we now have mills and malt houses. We have a milling manufacturer even in Vermont, and those mills are going around the world to help rebuild regional grain economies, New American Stone Mills. We have sturdy agricultural support from Cornell and the universities of Vermont and Maine. And we have bakeries and restaurants that feature Northeast grains. And we have a wicked great bunch of brewers and distillers having fun with local malt and local grains. So how did we get here? We got here with words that turned into actions. The change began in conversations, like the one we're going to have all day. My book came out 5 years ago, and the word conversation came up a lot. The first person who really named this was Andrea, saying that she began change through conversations. Conversations with local growers to get grains grown, talking to brewers to use local malt. The Farmer-Baker-Miller Partnership in Ithaca, New York, Oshner Farms, Wide Awake Bakery, and Farmer Ground Flour, they showed me everything. It was really good to have a Miller on speed dial when I was trying to figure out how to write about this stuff. June Russell of Grow NYC Grains told me about the slow and steady work that also began in conversations. First with the bakers who sold at Green Market to understand the barriers to accessing and using local flour. Next with farmers and mills in the geography that serves the New York City marketplace. What were the barriers for farmers? What was the milling capacity? Out of these conversations, change emerged. Talk became action in the form of a baker's rule that everyone selling bread, baked goods in Grow NYC's producer-only marketplace had to make a contribution to the agriculture. And that started out with a rule that they had to use 15% locally grown and ground grains, and now it's up to 25%. Many bakeries who sell at Grow NYC are regularly noticed for their extraordinary bread, but our flour isn't often talked about. That's what we're here to change. We're here to have a business community conversation about fostering further change. We need to prime the public's imagination to understand the grain supply chain and help build demand from the glass back to the ground and from the loaf back to the field. How are we going to do this? With words. We will first tell the stories to describe what's been lost and show what's happening now. We are going to make visible all the work in grains and grain-based products and help people understand why they should invest in the Northeast Grainshed, bottle by bottle and bread by bread. This is heavy lifting. The world is really chaotic these days, and that is a huge understatement. But part of the chaos, I think, is that industrialized agriculture and food processing have hidden our daily bread and spirits from everyday sight. Most of us can hardly imagine the roots of the metaphors that I named. But we're going to help people see that grains are part of an ecosystem. That people can eat and drink environmentally, that craft beer and craft bread and craft spirits can be engines of change. Funding another kind of agriculture right here in our beer shed, our spirit shed, and our bread shed. We're going to help people see that it's time to decommodify our bread supply and become beer and spirit stewards. We're going to help consumers see that community-based businesses can support the land and support each other in the daily business of being alive. I put up this picture of a prairie because the businesses and intersections of all of you working together remind me of a prairie ecosystem. The Land Institute is working in Kansas on natural systems agriculture. And scientists are working on plant breeding to mimic the way that prairies grow. There are many different kinds of plants in a prairie. The roots are deeper, and the plants are supporting each other, as well as the soil and microorganisms in that soil. The goal is to create staple crops that are perennial. You might have heard of Kernza. And if we don't have to plant grains annually, we can do a lot more for our ground too. Eventually, interplanting Kernza, perennial sorghum, perennial rice, and other staples might be the new normal that gets us through the climate chaos that's ramping up around the world. And I want to point out that Cornell is involved in that perennialization inquiry. And I'm sorry that I don't know if UVM and the University of Maine are. Here, I see all of you working together like the plants of the prairie. The plants are talking to each other, conferring as they work. Valley Malt and Wormtown, Trillium, Kent Falls, Throwback, all of these enterprises are like natural systems agriculture, or maybe we'll call them natural systems businesses. Individual operations that work in concert, as do the plants, soil, and microorganisms in the native grass prairies. Mills and malt houses are coordinating growth with farms, bakeries, breweries, and distilleries. All of these people are supporting each other, growing together, and monies are circulating within the Northeast rather than cycling back to the grain belt, where our dollars can barely support the fragile farm system. That farm system is built for high volume, low value production, and it's teetering on the brink because of its reliance on export markets. Do you know that most of our American grains are grown for exports or animal feed or ethanol? We can make a choice to grow grains for something much more directly linked to our survival. In this way, local beer and booze can and does support farms. Local bread is tied to a mill, and that's tied back to the land. These mills and malt houses that transform wheat and barley, the oats and corn that are becoming beverages and breakfast and pasta and toast, they are creating jobs and raising the economic value of farm goods. In the regional grain system, our dollars are helping farmers, millers, maltsters, brewers, bakers, and distillers. That's a lot of us. New York State has farm beverage laws, and I wonder if I could convince Governor Cuomo that we should also have state-level support to transition dairy farms into the emerging grain chain. That's a pipe dream. And we have our minds on actively dreaming here today. We're here to break the secret of fresh flour and fresh malt. This stuff deserves to be popular, and we can help surprise everyone into falling in love with it also. So let's get ready to work on this project. Again, I thank you for taking time to participate in this thinking today. This is heavy, steady work coming up, and I know we are ready for it. Take a look at your programs. We've embedded space in the programs for you to take notes, because your thoughts are part of the conversation that we're having. The work that we will do is going to forge our actions to come. We've set up today with lots of thoughtful conversations and dialogues so that we can prime our pumps to put our boots on the ground and together get ready to rebuild our Northeast grain shed. Thank you.